Wie du dich bewegst in deinem Outfit, Hammer, einzigartig, unglaublich, Hammer. Du weißt, dass du über.
In this episode, we're going to be discussing comparative and superlative, Komparativ, Superlativ. These are very useful and fun when we're talking about differences and similarities between objects, people, anything you can imagine. So in the comparative, we're just describing how something is bigger, taller, cooler, etc., than something else. So let's take, because we're learning about clothing in this chapter, eng, so an enge Jeans zum Beispiel, as a comparative. So in the regular way of conjugating, or I guess declinating, comparatives, we do the same thing we do in English. We just add er to the end. Or we can take another adjective, weit, or wide or loose when we're talking about clothing. Well, what would that comparative be? Weiter. Again, very regular, just like English, with an er at the end. So if we take an example, here we have a hipster hose, a hipster jeans. I'm sure we all have seen them. Hipsters have a tendency to wear tight jeans. So das ist eine Hipsterhose, die Hipsterhose. Die Hipsterhose ist sehr eng, ja. Die Hammerhose, MC Hammer, ist weit. Die Hammerhose ist weit. Die Hammerhose ist weiter als die Hipsterhose. Weiter with er on the end. Die Hipsterhose ist enger als die Hammerhose. So here we see we can compare objects, and it can be fun too. So the superlative means we're talking about the biggest, the tallest, the best thing. So we could say, die Hipsterhose ist am engsten. Or die Hammerhose ist am weitesten. So usually we use and sten or esten, depending on what letter that is right there. And remember, just like with verb conjugation, if the stem ends in a d or t, we usually add an extra e. If you want to say that the Hipsterhose is the tightest pants, for example, we would have to use a superlative a little bit differently. And that is, we could say die engste, capitalized. This would tell us that it's the tightest, just the tightest. Implicit noun, the tightest pants. Or we could say it explicitly, die engste Hose. Now notice that here, if we just say die engste, that is now becoming an adjectival noun, which means it's capitalized. Whereas if we already have a noun here, eng is not capitalized. But that's getting a little ahead of ourselves. There are a couple exceptions to this normal way of declinating comparative and superlative with the er and then the sten or esten. And just like in English, you can't say something is good and another thing is gooder. That just sounds stupid. So in German, because English is of course a Germanic language, we have a similar thing. So these are some exceptions. Gut becomes besser in the comparative, sounding similar to English. And then superlative is am besten. Or you could say, if we're talking about Hose and thus die, a die feminine noun, we could say die beste. Die Hammerhose ist die beste, implicitly, die beste Hose. Okay, so gut is one exception. Another exception is gern. We all know this mysterious particle that expresses you would like to do something, right? So for example, ich trinke gern Kaffee means you like to drink coffee. So the way that this works in the comparative and superlative is it becomes lieber, you'd rather do this, and am liebsten. So because that's a little bit tricky for us English speakers, let's do some examples with gern. So we know ich trinke gern Kaffee, aber ich trinke lieber Tee. So ich trinke gern Kaffee, ich trinke lieber Tee, aber ich trinke am liebsten Wasser, weil ich so gesund bin. So does everybody understand? So we have in this progression, I like to drink coffee, ich trinke gern Kaffee. I prefer, ich trinke lieber Tee, prefer to drink tea. But what I really prefer, am liebsten, is Wasser. Ich trinke am liebsten Wasser. Another exception that we have in the comparative superlative is viel. Viel becomes mehr. Just like in English, we don't say a lotter, we say more, right? So viel becomes mehr and am meisten. So I could say Markus spricht viel Englisch. Peter spricht mehr Englisch. Aber Johnny spricht am meisten. Oder you could say das meiste Englisch. Does that make sense? One more thing that we have to talk about with comparative and superlative, and their sometimes strange declinations, is the fact that with single syllable adjectives such as kurz or groß or lang, in the comparative and in the superlative, they often take umlauts. So, der Rock ist kürzer und am, and prepare, this is a mouthful, am kürzesten, am kürzesten, and we see the S10. So groß becomes größer, good umlaut and SZ practice for you, and am größten. Lang becomes, see if you can guess, länger, and längsten. Let's talk a little bit about making comparisons and expressing similarity and difference with the comparative and superlative. So, making comparisons. We can express similarity or difference between a couple different things. So the words that we use to make these expressions are different. So if we're expressing similarity, we use so, wie. Whereas if we're expressing difference, we use als plus the comparative. Let's look at some examples. So if we're expressing similarity, we could say, because we're talking about clothes, das Hemd ist so schön wie die Bluse. So the shirt is just as pretty as the blouse, or so pretty as the blouse. Or we could say, der Rock kostet genauso viel wie das Kleid. So you don't need this genau, but you could have it to emphasize that it costs just as much or exactly as much as the dress, right? So the skirt costs as much as the dress. So viel wie das Kleid. So if we're expressing similarity, we use so wie. And if you'll notice, the adjective that we have, for example, schön, just stays in its regular form. It's not in the comparative form. So let's just express some difference. If we're expressing difference, we use als plus the comparative. So for example, die Hose ist schöner als die Jeans. So everybody can see we have schöner, the ER tells us it's in the comparative form, and als. So it's prettier than the jeans. It's nicer. The pants are nicer than the jeans. Or to take another example, ich finde Kleider eleganter als Röcke. So I think the dresses are more elegant than skirts. So eleganter als. To use one of the exceptions, I could also express this in this way. I could just say, Kleider sind besser als Röcke. Besser als. So, vielen Dank fürs Zuschauen, and stay tuned for episode 2.2, where we discuss dative verbs and pronouns. Vielen Dank und bis zum nächsten Mal.